Resolving semantic disputes. This piece is about misunderstandings and how they happen. All sorts of problems arise when people talk past one another or fail to hear one another, or indeed talk past or fail to hear themselves. And so here I'd like to discuss so-called semantic disputes, disagreements over the meanings of words. We'll also look at solutions, what we can do both as speakers and as listeners to resolve these kinds of conflicts. But first, some background information. Semantic uncertainty. Some words in the English language have multiple and sometimes contradictory definitions depending on the context in which they're used. When a word can mean different things in this way, it's said to be either vague, polysemous, or ambiguous, which reach subtly different concepts. Vagueness is where there's a grey area in terms of what's actually being referred to, where there's a continuum of possible meanings and no specific boundaries given. For example, the word thing is extremely vague because there's no single discrete interpretation of what's being referred to. The word building is less vague, and the word bank is getting a bit more specific. Ambiguity is where there are two or more valid interpretations or senses of a word that refer to completely different things. For example, the word bank can refer to a financial institution or to the strip of land bordering a river. Ambiguity enables the creation of puns. An accountant wanted to see his cash flow, so he took some money out of the bank, turned around and threw it into the river. Yes, that's a double pun, but focus on the double meaning of the word bank. Polysemy is a specific type of ambiguity where the different interpretations of a word are related via a common etymological root. That is, they've come from the same source, they have the same history. For example, the word bank can refer to a financial institution or to a building which offers that institution's services. The two word senses obviously have different reference, that is, they refer to different things, but they still share a common origin. A vague word can also be ambiguous, but any other senses of that word don't necessarily have to also be vague. And the boundaries between the three types of semantic uncertainty are also a bit fuzzy, but it's helpful to at least be aware of the terminology. Semantic discord. Now, successful communication requires each party to interpret the other accurately. The context of a word can often help with its interpretation, and this is studied in the academic field of pragmatics. But in general, good communication becomes more difficult when words have multiple meanings. This is even true for intrapersonal communication, that is, for the discussion that goes on inside our own heads. For example, ambiguity can sometimes allow people to reason their way to dodgy conclusions. Imagine somebody who thinks that because feathers are light, and light things can't also be dark, a feather therefore can't be dark. What this person has done here in screwing around with the language is known as equivocation, and it's what philosophers call a logical fallacy, which basically means a crappy argument. But this kind of confusion can also happen with interpersonal communication, communication between people. In this context, equivocation is called semantic discord, and it's a major problem. Semantic discord is the situation where two parties disagree on the definition of a word or several words essential to communicating or formulating any concept at issue. In simple language, semantic discord is where words are understood or used differently between people. And this can result in semantic disputes, which are basically where two people are using differing definition for the words they're arguing with. These are pointless arguments because where people think that they're debating the nature of some commonly understood idea, they're not actually discussing the same one at all, but two that are subtly different. For example, in academic philosophy, we have our dualists versus monists, realists versus anti-realists, moral objectivists versus moral subjectivists, and the list goes on. These disagreements are almost universally the result of disagreement over the meaning of some word. For example, in my experience, both moral objectivists and moral subjectivists often agree on the science. They agree that humans have evolved their moral tastes through a process of natural selection, and that said moral preferences are, for all intents and purposes, universal. Where the disagreements begin is when we begin to ask whether there are moral facts, whether morality is objective, and so forth. because these answers will of course depend entirely on how terms such as fact or objective are understood, and those definitions need to be cleared up and agreed upon before the question can even be made sense of. The same sorts of issues can arise in debates over the nature of free will, consciousness, and many other protracted and seemingly insoluble arguments in philosophy. Semantic discord also has concerning effects on the world at large, especially in the way it drives conflicts from the intrapersonal to the interpersonal to the international, and especially those conflicts which we write off as intractable. Heated, ideologically polarizing arguments over foreign policy, welfare, abortion, immigration, what we're going to have for dinner tonight, and almost everything else under the sun are heavily influenced by the dynamics of semantic dispute. After all, these kinds of disputes represent a substantial barrier to constructive thought on any topic. So if semantic discord is such a significant and overlooked problem, then how can we deal with it? Disambiguation. If we're the speaker, that is, if we're giving information rather than receiving it, then we have the chance to disambiguate our language, to clarify the meaning of our words before anyone misinterprets them. There are four main ways to do this. 1. Replace the term with a less ambiguous one. 2. Require the other to use your terminology. 3. Be required by the other to use theirs. Or 4. Negotiate the terminology together. The first option, replacing an ambiguous term, is a really effective strategy when we just want to get our message across clearly and prevent semantic discord from arising in the first place. The major disadvantage is that usually the original word's way more concise than what we'd need to replace it with. It's quicker to say, I love you, than to say, I care about your well-being, even if the latter is far less ambiguous. And it would be pretty annoying having to say all of that each time. But we don't necessarily have to avoid the original term in order to pull off the word replacement strategy. We might just follow it up with a few near synonyms to get the point across. For example, I love you, care about you, want to be an asset and a friend to you. Each rephrasing of the concept further clarifies what we're referring to. It's a good, useful, and helpful trick, technique, strategy, approach to know about, but again, it can be incredibly tedious, bothersome, boring, downright annoying if we're not careful. We don't want to just sound like we're reading from a thesaurus either. So while word replacement can remove the ambiguity from the picture, it can also be annoying, and it doesn't actually resolve the underlying disagreement over what a word should mean. The second option, requiring another to use your terminology, is often sensible for published works such as books, videos, podcasts, and the like, where back and forth dialogue isn't possible. This is normally done with stipulative definitions, which prescribe the meanings of words in an authoritarian manner. The reader then has to simply accept these definitions and continue with them in mind. For example, if I'm a philosopher writing about moral goodness, I could provide my own definition up front. This method's fine in some situations, and it certainly removes ambiguity, but again, it's not going to change anybody's opinions on the correct meaning of the word in question. Somebody might think that I should define moral goodness differently than I did, and that person will probably struggle to read what I've written. The third option, playing on the terms of the other party, is rarer, but it can be used as a tactic in debates against stubborn opponents. When somebody wants to argue over words rather than ideas, we can simply accept their definitions and continue. There are trade-offs to this tactic because, again, it doesn't resolve the underlying disagreement, but it's sometimes a viable option and certainly worth knowing about. The fourth option, negotiation, is the most interesting tactic considering the way it relates to the evolution of language. Unlike the other three tactics, negotiation involves justifications, which means that both parties have a chance to learn something and use their words more carefully in the future, and so the language evolves. An interesting historical example of how resolutions can be negotiated is found in the book Pseudo-Problems: How Analytic Philosophy Gets Done by Roy A. Sorensen. Quote, on 3rd of July 1988, the US Navy warship Vincennes mistook an Iranian Airbus for an F-14 fighter jet and then shot it down, killing all 290 people aboard. 2 days later, a moderator of the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour asked his panelists whether the United States should apologize. Some said yes because of the tremendous harm the US had inflicted. Others said no because the shooting was in self-defense. The no apology group stressed that the commander had just finished a battle with 2 Iranian PT boats, that he had issued 7 unheeded warnings, and that the jet flew in a way uncharacteristic of a civilian aircraft. The debaters eventually recognized the ambiguity of apology. The no apology group had construed apologise to mean an expression of remorse, that is, as a repudiation of the deed as unjustified. The pro-apology group took apologise to mean an expression of regret. Here one only laments the consequences of the act. Once their wires were uncrossed, all sides agreed that the United States should express regret but not remorse." End quote. So for a longer-term resolution of the issue, this kind of negotiation is ideal. Here the 2 parties learned to simply avoid the vague word apologise in favour of the more specific express regret, and their dispute was settled. Now it's important to note that this vague word, apologise, is still out there in the wild, waiting to be misconstrued and to cause petty arguments for others in the future. It's like an old landmine that's known to be there. We might be able to avoid the hazard ourselves, but it's surely best to remove it entirely and help others avoid it too in the process. But then again, is this really the issue? Perhaps people need to learn to be aware of the presence of vagueness and of how to avoid it. And perhaps words such as apologise are intended to be vague. If we wanted a more specific word or phrase, we'd find one, in the same manner that express regret was decided upon above. Now, like vagueness, ambiguity also tends to cause issues. And the ambiguous words with 2 completely different meanings, such as the bank of a river versus bank the financial institution, aren't so much the problem. Linguists at MIT reckon this kind of ambiguity could actually help us communicate, because the words that contain this kind of obvious ambiguity are often short, easy ones, allowing their reuse, and hence the formation of shorter sentences that still get the point across without much risk of misinterpretation. But as Sorensen points out, the words to really watch are those with the most similar double meanings. Quote, "If the discussants are fortunate, they find each other's behaviour bizarre enough to question whether they're talking about the same thing. This makes many ambiguous disputes self-correcting. Of course, the heat of a dispute temporarily lowers confidence in human rationality. Thus, detached third parties are often the first to suspect an ambiguity. In any case, most grossly ambiguous disputes are quickly detected. The troublesome debates equivocate between nearly identical questions, for the resemblance will prevent the disputants from appearing bizarre enough to force recognition that they're addressing different questions." End quote. A good example of this type of sneaky ambiguity that I came across recently is the word subjective, and the issue becomes apparent when we ask the question, can something be both objective and subjective to me at the same time? Here there are 2 competing definitions for subjective, one being everything we experience, the other being everything which is not objective. Another example is the word respect. A subtle double meaning is evident when we ask, do people need to earn respect, or is everybody entitled to it? A certain conservative intellectual has been known to disagree with the liberal mantra of everybody being entitled to it by claiming that respect would have no useful function if it was just given out randomly. To which the liberal side predictably responds that everybody's deserving of being treated with dignity, and especially in the eyes of the law. This is a disagreement over definitions, and yet it's been turned into an intense and politicized debate. In general, the most contested words are those to which value in the moral and political sense of the term is attached. For instance, linguist and activist Noam Chomsky argues that there's been a vulgar politicization of the word genocide, which is now so extreme that he rarely uses the word at all. Chomsky also claims that many other political terms are imprecise. Of anarchism, he declares, it resists any characterization. These are just a few examples. Words such as liberal, freedom, conservative, capitalism, and so forth can be so contested that it becomes difficult to have constructive conversations about them. This partly explains why there's a common etiquette of not discussing religion or politics in everyday contexts. When the words are ambiguous and the ideas are sensitive, people will often go for the most negative interpretation, making hurtful interactions inevitable. Which brings us on to what we can do if we're in the position of the listener. Active listening. To listen is to try to interpret another person's speech correctly, but active listening is specifically where we're doing so using back and forth interaction with the speaker. If we're listening to somebody and we detect ambiguity, then the most obvious active listening technique that we can use is to ask for clarification. This is an extremely effective technique for keeping discussions on track, but in practice it's usually limited to conversations between small numbers of people, considering it requires interrupting the speaker. Another useful technique is paraphrasing, where we repeat our interpretation of the speaker's claim back to them. For example, "I'm hearing you say the following," and so forth. To show the speaker that we're genuinely trying to understand and empathize with them, we can even explicitly ask, "Is this a fair interpretation of what you said?" and request that they stop us if they feel as though we've put words into their mouth in any way. So those are a couple of helpful active listening techniques. But if it isn't possible to stop somebody mid-speech to paraphrase them or to ask them questions, we can still employ passive listening techniques in order to cut down on misunderstandings. Passive listening. Passive listening is where we're listening to somebody without interrupting them, as you probably are now. Interpreting ambiguity involves predicting the as yet unknown, and in passive listening we're denied the privilege of being able to constantly cheat and look at the answers in the way that we can when we're active listening. Because listening, and especially passive listening, involves prediction, it's a scientific process like any other, where we can use hypothesis testing in an attempt to draw the best conclusions we can given the available evidence. Therefore, as for all good science, we need to be aware of bias in order to avoid jumping to unjustified conclusions. There are many biases that can fool us. I recommend reading Wikipedia's list. For example, sometimes our fears and insecurities will drive an irrationally negative interpretation of the evidence, something known as pessimism bias. For example, a young couple were sitting in their car waiting at the lights. The man sighed. "We're going nowhere," he murmured despondently. The woman responded with a look of pain and hurt. "What have I done?" she asked quietly. He looked confused but soon picked up on what had happened and laughed. "I was referring to our car, not our relationship, silly." "Phew," she exclaimed, "you had me worried there." In this case, the woman's fears are driving her to take an irrationally negative interpretation of the situation. This phenomenon can also work the other way around in the case of optimism bias, wishful thinking, where our wishes and desires can drive an irrationally positive interpretation. For example, the little boy who likes a girl and thinks, "She looked at me, she must like me back." These are just two of many biases that are worth knowing about. Now, while we all have to make decisions based on limited information, there's a difference between taking a calculated risk, that is, being aware of the decision being based on uncertain assumptions, and jumping to conclusions, which is where we're unaware of the uncertainty of the assumptions. Mistakes are way more common when we aren't even aware that we're jumping to conclusions and instead believe that our interpretation is absolutely definitely true. So just being aware of biases automatically makes us less at risk of misunderstanding ambiguous situations. Now, ideally, we're able to reduce the ambiguity by asking for more information, but this isn't always possible, in which case we'll still have to make a judgment of some sort. In these situations, it's usually best to assume that the other person has a good reason for saying whatever they did, a form of bias known as charitable interpretation. This is actually a good bias to have because it tends to make communication easier. If we go around assuming people are irrational and ignorant, we're going to write them off pretty quickly. We're going to stop listening to them. Whereas if we assume that other people have something to say, we're going to try to get more information before we pass judgment, which often makes things easier. For example, if I'm reading some philosophy or psychology paper and they're talking about something being subjective, I don't just drop the paper disgusted that they're using such ambiguous wording. Instead, I give them benefit of the doubt and assume that they're rational people who just happen not to be aware of the ideas that we've covered so far here in this piece. And because I'm assuming that they're rational, I simply choose the interpretation that makes the most sense in the context they're using it. There might be a bit of ambiguity, but if we search for hints in the context of the writing, we can usually make sense of it if we just assume that whoever wrote it is a reasonable and consistent person. Doing this significantly cuts down on misinterpretations. Now, of course, it's entirely possible that somebody might be genuinely trying to confuse us, So if we notice that this is happening regularly, we should probably stop giving them a charitable interpretation and instead address the fact that they're engaging with us in bad faith. Conclusions. So how do we resolve semantic disputes? There are a few approaches depending on whether we're the speaker or the listener. If we're the speaker, then we need to achieve a kind of semantic hygiene with our words. The first way we might do this is to completely avoid the word so as to avoid its associated ambiguity. But this may sometimes inhibit communication rather than improving it, because ideas require labels in order to be discussed, and imprecise labels are sometimes better than none. Another option is to force others to use our definitions, the problem with this being that it doesn't resolve the underlying disagreement about what the word should mean. We could also proceed by simply accepting others' definitions, but again, that disagreement will remain. It seems that the most effective long-term solution to many human conflicts is to negotiate an agreement with all the relevant stakeholders at the table. So why not take the same approach with semantic conflicts? We can propose a more concise definition whilst providing good reasons for it, and constructively finding and considering any criticism of them. If the reasoning is persuasive enough to convince others that it's more useful to consider the word in such a way, then perhaps they'll also adopt it for their own communication, and it'll become a part of the language. And if we're in the position of a listener, then we need to employ either an active or passive approach, depending on what the situation permits. If we're taking the active approach, then we might ask the speaker for clarification, or perhaps we might paraphrase them in order to reconfirm their message. Whereas if we're taking the passive approach, we need to be aware of our biases and keep them in mind when we're listening. If we do need to make a decision based on limited information, as is often the case, then we want to avoid jumping to dodgy conclusions. We can try taking more calculated risks, and we can also err on the side of caution with a charitable interpretation of the other person's message. And if we can learn all these skills and apply them, then we should be able to think and communicate more clearly with ourselves and others, leading to less misunderstandings and conflict and more constructive thoughts and dialogue.